I wanted to share another piece of writing with you guys that talks about why I decided to run for city council. And, before this conversation today, um, um, Brother Briones and I had a conversation, and some of the areas that we thought might be important, I think, are captured in this essay. Um, so my whole life, I have served my community. I have seen how policy impacts people's lives. My first job was with Junior Achievement of the Upper Midwest. I worked as a business basics recruiter. I recruited volunteers to go into the 5th and 6th grade classrooms to teach business basics once a week. One of my recruits was then City Council President Jackie Cherry Holmes. She thought it was critical for young people to meet adults in leadership roles. And I thought it was inspiring to see political leaders like Jackie engage with their community. My next job was as a counselor at a chemical dependency treatment center. There, I helped people, mostly people of color, find employment as they worked to overcome addictions. This was in the early 1990s. The crack epidemic was in full swing in Minneapolis, and there was no shortage of people to work with. Many of my clients were dealing with the unjust minimum sentencing standards. And just as an interesting point of information, the treatment center that I worked at is called Turning Point Inc. It's in North Minneapolis. And George Floyd came to Minneapolis from Houston, Texas, to go into treatment at Turning Point. And so, I don't know, it's just a little interesting circular kind of transition that, you know, funny how these things shape our world. But I saw how these blanket policies contributed to the ongoing inequities in our society. I saw how these policies led to America becoming the world's most incarcerated country by per capita. I saw how they could tear families apart, not just my clients' families, but my own as well. My little brother fell victim to the crack cocaine addiction and was imprisoned and then died from the ravages he experienced. Of course, now we're seeing something different happening with drug policies. The opioid epidemic, an epidemic that impacts more white families. The conversation has now shifted to from incarceration to compassion. After that, I worked for Hennepin County, where I was a counselor for mothers and families receiving public assistance. In 1996, the Clinton administration passed the Welfare Reform Act. And the amount of time a family could receive federal cash assistance was limited to 5 years. Once again, I saw how policy could put a heavy burden on people. And in this case, it was women and children. Policy can have a big impact on people's lives. It certainly has had one on mine, particularly as I came to terms with my own gender identity. From a very young age, I felt different. But I also felt the societal pressure to conform to the ideals of masculinity. So I tried, rather successfully, I might add, to go along. I played football in high school. I joined a fraternity in college, actually became president of said fraternity. I got married and fathered a beautiful daughter. However, the internal struggle to be one's true self is powerful. I came out to my family as bisexual, but that was not the full truth. I wanted to be fully authentic with myself and with those I love. As it turns out, that my city, Minneapolis, was a pretty good place to do that. Minneapolis was actually the first city in the country to pass protections for transgender people. So 5 years after working for Hennepin County, I came out as a transgender woman. This was one of the most liberating experiences in my life. I joined several nonprofit organizations, at first as a way to ensure that I had allies if I ever needed them. But after a while, I found that the more I fought to improve the lives of others, I was improving life for myself. I worked for the county for another 5 years after that. Coming to terms with my true self allowed me to flourish in ways that I hadn't been able to before. I wanted to do more than improve people's lives. I wanted to do more to improve people's lives. So I finished my undergraduate degree after 20 years. I went on to obtain a graduate degree in community economic development. After I graduated, I attended the Community Leadership Institute at the University of St. Thomas, and there I met a young Robert Lilligren, who was running for city council. When he won his seat, he appointed me to serve as his senior policy aide in City Hall. And that's how I started working in politics and seeing how you could improve people's lives through elected office. I went on to serve in this role for 2 subsequent city council members for a total of 12 years. During doing this work, I learned the rigors of elected office and the fortitude required to fight for equity and full equality for all people. I also learned that if you want to be effective, you have to have a broad-based intersectional approach. Robert identifies as a Native American gay man, but that never defined how he governed. Rather, it informed his decision-making. In 2016, when my former boss, Elizabeth Glidden, decided not to seek re-election, I started to thinking about running for office myself. I attended campaign trainings through the Victory Fund, a group that teaches LGBTQ people how to run for office. And I put together an amazing group of activists, community leaders, and politicos, who, by the way, were almost all women. And we put together a campaign plan. I was already planning to run when America elected a reality TV star to be our president. But that election gave me extra incentive. I knew that cities were going to become the center of political change in our society. And I knew that I wanted to be a part of that change. What I didn't know is that George Floyd would get murdered in my district and I would be at the epicenter of that. But that's how politics is. So a couple of community members organized this campaign on Facebook called Run, Andrea, Run. It got more than 500 likes and comments encouraging me to run for office. It was clear that people needed someone to believe in light of that 2016 election. So I announced that I was running for office 1 month before Donald Trump was sworn into office. And actually, just a little insider information today, I am formally announcing that I am running for re-election uh, just a couple of months after Donald Trump uh, has been kicked out of office. Yes. Um, so, but for the first 5 months of my campaign, we did not have an opponent, at least not a personal one. But I told my team that we were always running against the opponents of racism, sexism, and transphobia. And we saw those opponents at work in little ways and big ways on the campaign trail. At one event, a person assumed that I must be running in the ward representing the predominantly Black community on the north side. And in fact, I was running to represent a more diverse community on the south side. Another time, a person asked me bluntly, "So how do you handle door knocking as a Black transgender person?" Facing things like that, I knew that we needed to run a campaign that was focused on the issues, the policies that impact people's lives in the 8th Ward and throughout the city of Minneapolis. We hosted our own community forums. We showed up at community events. We went to neighborhood meetings, parades, ice cream socials, you name it. We made thousands of phone calls and knocked on hundreds of doors. We worked hard to reach every voter. We especially wanted to reach out to people who weren't likely to show up to vote, folks who had been historically shut out of the electoral process. We wanted to engage young people of color who had never voted before. We wanted to engage the immigrant community, the transgender community, and the broader LGBT community. And all of that work paid off. We increased voter turnout in my district by 11%, and it was a pretty high voter turnout already. And we won the seat with 73% of the vote. And as you guys know, today's electoral politics, if you get 51% of the vote, you're doing pretty good. It still blows my mind to this day. But to me, it says that people want change. They want rights for immigrants, people with disabilities, and LGBTQIA people. They want women's rights and reproductive rights. They believe that Black lives matter. They want to see everyone treated as equal human beings, and they want everyone's lives to be better. I have seen how policy impacts people's lives, politics too. The late senator from Minnesota, Paul Wellstone, said that politics is about improving people's lives. And that's why I run, and that's why I serve.